Deep beneath the forests south of Berlin, there's a concrete labyrinth that shouldn't exist. Two massive bunker complexes, codenamed Maybach I and Maybach II, sprawling across the town of Zossen like buried cities. These aren't your typical wartime shelters. We're talking about command centres that once controlled armies across 3 continents, communication hubs that coordinated millions of soldiers, and underground fortresses designed to survive direct aerial bombardment. Between 1937 and 1945, this place was the nerve centre of Nazi Germany's entire military machine. Then in April 1945, Soviet forces arrived. They found something extraordinary. And what happened next, what became of these bunkers after the war ended, tells a story that almost nobody outside of Germany knows about. The scale is difficult to comprehend without seeing it. Maybach I, built between 1937 and 1939, contained over 20 buildings connected by underground passages. Reinforced concrete walls up to 3 meters thick. Air filtration systems capable of supporting thousands of personnel during gas attacks. Its own power station, water treatment facility, and telecommunications equipment that could reach U-boats in the Atlantic and tank divisions on the Eastern Front simultaneously. This was where the Wehrmacht High Command, the OKW, directed Germany's military operations. Every major campaign, every strategic decision, every troop movement across Europe, North Africa, and the Soviet Union was coordinated from rooms buried under German soil. Maybach II sat just 2 kilometers away, slightly smaller, but equally sophisticated. This housed the Army High Command, the OKH, responsible for ground forces specifically. Between these 2 complexes, you had the complete command structure of one of history's most powerful military forces, all concentrated in an area smaller than most university campuses. The security was obsessive. Multiple checkpoints, guard towers, barbed wire perimeters extending hundreds of meters. Above ground, the buildings were camouflaged as ordinary residential structures. From the air, Allied reconnaissance planes saw what appeared to be a small German village. They had no idea that beneath those fake houses, generals were planning operations that would determine the fate of millions. The communication technology installed here was cutting edge for 1940s standards. Pneumatic tube systems shot messages between departments at high speed. Teletype machines clattered constantly, receiving reports from front lines thousands of kilometers away. Radio equipment filled entire rooms, operated by technicians working in shifts around the clock. There were mat rooms where walls displayed the constantly changing positions of German and Allied forces, updated hourly as new intelligence arrived. Conference chambers where Hitler himself occasionally appeared to meet with military leadership. The bunkers even had their own narrow-gauge railway system running through the tunnels, transporting personnel and supplies between sections without ever surfacing. Walk through Zossen today and you'll find a ghost town frozen in concrete. After Germany's surrender, Soviet forces occupied the bunkers immediately. They understood the strategic value. For the next 49 years, from 1945 until 1994, these complexes served as headquarters for Soviet and later Russian forces in East Germany. The Soviets expanded portions, added their own equipment, and maintained the facilities in operational condition throughout the Cold War. It became one of the largest Soviet military installations outside the USSR itself, housing communications equipment that connected Moscow with its forces across Eastern Europe. But here's where the story gets strange. When Russian forces finally withdrew in 1994 after German reunification, they didn't destroy the bunkers. They didn't fill them with concrete or blow the entrances. They just left. Sealed some sections, removed sensitive equipment, and departed. The German government inherited 2 massive underground complexes that had served as command centres for 2 different military superpowers across 5 decades. What do you do with something like that? The answer turned out to be complicated. The bunkers were too historically significant to destroy, too expensive to maintain, and too sensitive to open fully to the public. Some sections were sealed permanently, others became the subject of preservation efforts by historical societies. A few areas opened for guided tours, allowing visitors to walk through rooms where generals once planned invasions. But large portions remained closed, accessible only to researchers with special permits. Nature began reclaiming the surface structures. Trees grew through collapsed roofs. Vines covered concrete walls. The fake village buildings that once camouflaged the complex started genuinely resembling ruins. Underground, it's a different world. The main tunnel systems remain largely intact. Moisture seeps through cracks in the concrete. Metal fixtures rust slowly in the darkness. But the bones of the structure, those massive reinforced walls and corridors, those will outlast anyone reading this. You can still see the Cyrillic labels Soviet technicians painted over German signs. Equipment from 3 different eras sits abandoned in storage rooms. German telecommunications gear from the 1940s, Soviet radio equipment from the 1960s and 70s, and more modern Russian systems from the 1990s, all left behind like layers of archaeological sediment. What makes Zossen particularly haunting isn't just its size or historical importance. It's the realization that this place witnessed the planning of some of humanity's darkest moments. Then, continued operating for another half-century under different flags. The decisions made in those rooms shaped battlefield outcomes across 2 continents. Operations were coordinated, intelligence was analysed, and strategic directives were transmitted to field commanders who never knew where their orders originated. In 1996, 2 years after the Russian withdrawal, German historical preservation societies began documenting what remained. Their reports described something closer to an underground city than a military installation. There were dormitories capable of housing over 3,000 personnel, industrial kitchens that could prepare 10,000 meals daily, a hospital with full surgical facilities, X-ray equipment, and dedicated wards for different types of casualties, water treatment plants that could process hundreds of thousands of litres per day, power generation systems with enough fuel reserves to operate independently for 6 months. This wasn't designed for temporary refuge during a bombardment. This was infrastructure for sustained underground existence. The telecommunications equipment tells its own story. In sections Soviet forces hadn't stripped completely, researchers found racks of switching gear connecting thousands of telephone lines, radio transmitters powerful enough to reach submarines in the Atlantic, and coding machines for scrambling sensitive communications. The Germans had installed pneumatic tube networks throughout the complex, shooting message canisters between departments at remarkable speed. You can still see these tubes running along corridor ceilings, their brass fittings tarnished but intact. Some sections retain their original furniture, metal desks bolted to concrete floors, filing cabinets containing documents the Soviets apparently deemed worthless. Wall maps with unit positions marked in grease pencil, never erased. One conference room, discovered sealed behind a collapsed section of tunnel in 2003, contained a table set for a meeting that clearly never concluded. Papers scattered across its surface, chairs pushed back as if the occupants had left mid-discussion, coffee cups still sitting where they'd been placed. The room had been perfectly preserved by the dry, stable underground environment. What researchers found most unsettling was the sheer mundane bureaucracy of it all. These weren't torture chambers or horrific experimental facilities. They were offices, accounting departments tracking supply expenditures, personnel offices managing duty rosters, communications centres routing messages, cafeterias where people ate lunch, libraries where officers read technical manuals during breaks. The architecture of systematic warfare reduced to filing systems and organisational charts. The complex even had recreational facilities, a cinema where propaganda films were screened, exercise rooms, a barbershop, living quarters with personal touches, photographs pinned to walls, books on shelves. People had lived entire portions of their lives in these tunnels, never seeing daylight for weeks at a stretch. Some Soviet-era additions created bizarre juxtapositions. In one section, German telecommunications equipment sits beside 1970s Soviet radio gear. The architectural styles clash visually. German precision engineering meets Soviet industrial pragmatism. Different eras of military technology frozen side by side in the same chamber. It's like walking through a timeline of Cold War communications development compressed into single rooms. Security at Zossen today remains surprisingly tight for a supposedly abandoned facility. Certain sections are permanently sealed with concrete barriers. Others have locked steel gates installed by German authorities after reunification. Signs warn against unauthorized entry. Regular patrols check perimeters. The German government maintains this isn't about hiding anything sinister. It's about safety. Decades of neglect have made portions structurally unstable. Tunnels have flooded. Ceilings have collapsed in places. The complex is genuinely dangerous to explore without proper equipment and expertise. But that explanation hasn't stopped urban explorers. Online forums dedicated to abandoned military sites treat Zossen as a holy grail. Photographs smuggled out show remarkable preservation in some areas, devastating decay in others. Explorers describe navigating through pitch darkness, wading through waist-deep water in flooded sections, finding rooms that look recently abandoned despite being empty for decades. The accounts have a dreamlike quality, describing a space that feels frozen between two different wars, belonging fully to neither. Some of the most significant discoveries came from environmental studies conducted in the early 2000s. Scientists testing water and soil contamination found evidence of chemical storage the Soviets had never fully documented. Nothing immediately dangerous, but proof that complete inventories of what happened underground may never exist. Layers of secrecy from two different military powers overlap, creating gaps in the historical record that can't be fully reconstructed. The fake village above the bunkers has achieved its own strange status. The buildings originally constructed as camouflage now genuinely appear abandoned. Trees grow through roofs, windows are broken, paint has long since peeled away, but the structures themselves remain silent markers above the invisible city below. Local residents largely ignore them. To outsiders unfamiliar with the history, they look like any other cluster of derelict rural buildings scattered across the German countryside, which, in a sense, was always the point. Preservation efforts focus primarily on documentation rather than restoration. The scale is simply too vast, the cost too high. Instead, historical societies photograph everything accessible. Record measurements, interview former personnel willing to disk. You assess their service, creating archives of a place that may eventually collapse entirely. The concrete will last centuries, but without active maintenance, water infiltration will eventually win. Sections will flood permanently. Tunnels will become impassable. The underground city will transform into something closer to an archaeological site than a functional structure. Questions about Zossen's future grow more urgent as the structures age. Should Germany invest in preservation, accepting this as part of national history? Or let nature reclaim what both the Wehrmacht and Red Army built? There's no easy answer. The complex represents technological achievement intertwined with horrific ideology, military innovation serving genocidal purposes. Some historians argue preservation matters precisely because it's uncomfortable. Walking through those tunnels forces confrontation with how ordinary bureaucracy enabled extraordinary evil. The telecommunications equipment, the filing systems, the organized efficiency, all of it served the Holocaust and aggressive war. Forgetting feels easier than remembering, but forgetting guarantees repetition. Others counter that maintaining Nazi infrastructure honors it somehow. Better to let it collapse, they argue, returning the land to peaceful use. The debate mirrors larger German struggles with Third Reich heritage. How do you acknowledge history without glorifying it? Where's the line between education and memorialization? The Soviets added their own layer of complexity. Their occupation wasn't liberation for everyone. East Germans lived under a different dictatorship for 45 years. The Soviet modifications to Zossen represent that era, too. The complex became a palimpsest, each military power writing over the previous one without fully erasing what came before. Technology continues advancing past what Zossen represents. The cutting-edge communications equipment installed in the 1930s and 1970s is now museum-worthy obsolescence. Modern militaries operate with satellite networks, encrypted digital systems, drone coordination requiring bandwidth those old installations never imagined. Zossen's technical specifications matter mainly to historians now, not strategists. Yet the psychological impact endures. Former personnel who served there, both German and Soviet, describe the place as haunting even during active use. The weight of being underground for extended periods. The recycled air, the fluorescent lighting creating permanent artificial day. The knowledge that you are participating in command structures controlling vast military forces. Several accounts mention dreams continuing decades after service ended. Dreams of endless concrete corridors leading nowhere. Local communities near Zossen maintain complicated relationships with the complex. It's simultaneously a historical site, a safety hazard, and a tourist curiosity. Some residents wish it would simply disappear, tired of trespassers and the area's dark associations. Others recognise its educational value, understanding that physical spaces teach differently than textbooks. The bunkers influenced Cold War bunker design worldwide. American and British military planners studied Zossen after the war, incorporating lessons into their own underground facilities. The layout principles, the ventilation systems, the communication redundancies, all influenced NATO construction standards. In that sense, Zossen's engineering legacy spread far beyond Germany, shaping how militaries worldwide conceived hardened command posts. Certain details remain classified even now: specific tunnel dimensions, exact locations of some entrances, particular technical capabilities. The German military maintains that revealing everything would compromise current security, though critics question what 1930s bunker layouts could possibly threaten modern operations. More likely, bureaucratic inertia keeps files locked simply because they've always been locked. Artists have found inspiration in Zossen's decay. Photographers document the interplay of light and shadow in flooded chambers. Filmmakers use the tunnels as locations for period pieces and dystopian science fiction. The visual aesthetics of abandonment, particularly in spaces once representing ultimate control and order, create powerful imagery. There's something compelling about nature defeating concrete, about chaos reclaiming what was built to impose absolute structure. The wildlife that's moved into accessible areas adds unexpected life. Bats roost in some chambers. Birds nest where ventilation shafts meet the surface. Small mammals navigate the tunnels. The ecosystem developing in these spaces exists entirely separate from human intention, thriving in abandonment where military precision once dominated. Weather patterns affect the complex in ways designers never anticipated. Freeze-thaw cycles crack concrete. Rain infiltration overwhelms drainage systems designed for sealed environments. Seasonal temperature variations stress materials constantly. The structures were built to withstand bombing, not decades of neglect. Nature attacks through patience rather than force. Digital documentation projects race against deterioration. Laser scanning creates three-dimensional models of tunnel networks before they become impassable. These virtual recreations preserve spatial relationships even after physical collapse. Future researchers will explore Zossen through computer simulations, walking corridors that no longer physically exist. The monetary cost of proper preservation would run to hundreds of millions of euros. Complete restoration is financially impossible. Partial preservation faces difficult choices about which sections matter most. Do you save the German command center? The Soviet additions, the telecommunications hub, limited budgets force prioritization that inevitably reflects contemporary values about which history deserves protection. Comparisons to other abandoned military sites reveal common patterns. Across Europe, massive Cold War installations sit empty, too expensive to demolish, too specialized to repurpose. Zossen is exceptional in scale, but typical in its fate. The military architecture of the 20th century increasingly becomes archaeology. What happens next remains genuinely uncertain. Zossen exists in limbo, neither preserved nor destroyed, accessible yet forbidden, historically significant yet practically abandoned. It's a monument to how quickly absolute power becomes irrelevant, how thoroughly military might can be rendered obsolete. The tunnels that once coordinated armies now host only darkness, water, and the slow, patient work of decay. Two different military powers built their futures there. Both are gone. Only the concrete remains, waiting to see whether it will be remembered or simply forgotten beneath the German countryside. Zossen forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about power and permanence. These bunkers, designed to last 1,000 years, couldn't survive 50 without purpose. The concrete endures, but everything it represented dissolved completely. 2 empires commanded the world from these rooms and both vanished, leaving only tunnels filling slowly with water, and the question of whether some places are better left to collapse than to remember.